Hi everyone, my name is Olivia Dittmann. I decided to focus my research project on the gender differences between males and females during an argument. I became really interested in this topic during Packet 5 when we read the articles by Eckert and Tannen about the differences between males and females. I really liked learning about how males and females are treated differently growing up and how, as they get older, they interact with one another differently. My research question was, are there differences in the ways that males and females argue? If so, what are those differences and what can they be attributed to? This is really important to study because we want to understand how children are raised and how that might interfere with how they act as an adult. This research could also help lower rates of domestic violence. If we understand how males and females argue, we can be better prepared for how they are going to interact with one another during an argument and hopefully prevent any injuries from occurring in cases of domestic violence. According to the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence, typically over 20,000 calls are made to a domestic violence hotline daily. They could be quoted writing, on average, nearly 20 people per minute are physically abused by an intimate partner in the United States. This equates to more than 10 million men and women during 1 year. Although 15% might not seem like a huge percentage, it becomes incredibly alarming when you realize that intimate partner violence accounts for 15% of all violent crime in the United States. Before starting my research, I reread both of the packets from Packet 5 from Eckert and Tannen to familiarize myself with the concepts and what they were studying in order to apply it to my research. The first source I used was the first chapter of the book Language and Gender by Penelope Eckert and Sally McConnell Gannett. This chapter studies the biological and societal differences among gender from birth. It also goes into detail about the differences between the genders, like the biological differences, the differences in puberty, common stereotypes, the way gender should act, and about how babies are interacted with from birth by their parents. Eckert can be quoted saying, "Parents use more diminutives, kitty, doggy, when speaking to girls than to boys. They use more interstate words, happy, sad, when speaking to girls, and they use more direct prohibitives, don't do that, and more empathetic prohibitives, no, 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 to boys than to girls." This is one of the first notable differences between treatments of males and females when it comes to behavior. Eckert also explains that typically male and female infants cry the same amount when they were young, but as they mature, male infants cry less, whereas the female infants typically cry the same amount as they did when they were younger. Eckert also explains notable differences in behavior during playtime when it comes to males and females. As they grow up, males and females typically play with the same toys and interact the same way, but once they reach about 2 is when they start to stray into the, quote, more gender-appropriate toys, such as trucks and cars for boys and dolls and playhouses for girls. This source was incredibly useful to my research because it gave me a background on how males and females are treated differently and why this would affect how they act as an adult. The second source I used from Packet 5 was Chapter 8 of Deborah Tannen's article, Talk in the Intimate Relationship, His and Hers. This article dives deep into communication differences and conversational techniques used by men and women. The article really goes deep into the concept of meta messages, which are hidden messages in conversation that most of the time women pick up on or listen for that men don't really pay attention to. Because women are so prone to listening for these meta messages and men don't really see it as well as women do, this can cause a lot of discomfort in relationships and misunderstanding. Tannen can be quoted saying, "Women are more focused on involvement that is on relationships among people, and it is through meta messages that relationships among people are established and maintained." I wanted to focus my research from Tannen on the concept of meta messages because I thought that it was really interesting that women don't really listen to the surface of a conversation, but they listen to what's beneath it, whereas men just kind of focus on the surface of the conversation and the actual words that were said. Tannen describes the concepts of meta messages with an example between characters Harriet and Morton. I'm going to read the situation straight from her article, just so that I don't miss out on any important parts. She states, "When Morton announces, quote, 'I think I'll go for a walk,' end quote, Harriet feels specifically uninvited, though Morton later claims she would have been welcome to join him. She felt locked out by his use of I and his omission of an invitation, "Would you like to come?" She later goes on to say Harriet would never announce, quote, "I'm going for a walk," end quote, without inviting him to join her. If he talks differently to her, it must be that he feels differently. But Morton wouldn't feel unloved if Harriet didn't ask about his day, and he would feel free to ask, "Can I come along?" if she announced she was taking a walk. So he can't believe she is justified in feeling responses he knows he wouldn't have. Harriet was focused on the meta message of Morton not specifically saying, "Do you want to come?" whereas Morton was just focusing on his statement, "I'm going for a walk," thinking that Harriet would invite herself, which he would have had no problem with. The source was incredibly useful because it showed the concept of meta messages in a really deep way, and it really showed the negative side effects of misunderstanding and miscommunication, especially when it comes to arguments. For my research itself, I did 2 observations and then 4 interviews. Both of my observations were unplanned between 2 separate couples, but for my interviews, I used both of those couples so that I would have a constant variable of the people that I was using. The first observation I did was between my 2 friends, Jane and Kyle, who have been together for roughly 5 months. Jane is a 19-year-old female and Kyle is a 21-year-old male. This observation occurred around 7 p.m. on a Saturday and lasted for roughly 45 minutes. As I said previously, this was unplanned. I was just hanging out with Jane at her house when she called Kyle on FaceTime. Jane was very upset with something Kyle had said previously in the day, and Kyle didn't really understand why she was so upset. Jane was really frustrated with how lightly Kyle was taking the situation. Throughout the conversation, I just sat there on my phone, watching and listening without interrupting. I wanted to make sure I captured the essence of the conversation without interrupting and changing the way it would go. The second observation occurred between my Uncle Joe and Aunt Hannah, who are 47 and 46 years old and have been married for 19 years. This observation occurred around 6 o'clock on a Sunday at my grandma's house. My Uncle Joe was going around asking people what they wanted from the grill, but when he got over to Hannah, he skipped right over her without asking. This made her really upset, and she thought that he, quote, didn't care to ask what she wanted, when in actuality he knew what she was going to ask for and just didn't want to bother her. I conducted my interviews on these 4 people separately and make sure that they didn't interact with one another in between interviews. Here are the questions listed above on what I asked. I then explained Tannen's Harriet and Morton example, but excluded what each of them did and how they reacted, and then asked my interviewees to explain what they would do in that situation. Following that, I told them what actually happened and then had them react. I was really surprised to find out that the males and females I interviewed reacted the same way that Harriet and Morton did in this situation. It was really interesting and showed the importance of meta messages and how crucial they are to understanding conversation and how they can really misconstrue a meaning. It was also really interesting to hear the interview responses because each person in the relationship kind of shared similar ideas of who would be first to crime or who started the most arguments. But when it came to the last question about showing emotion during an argument, or whether it's more anger than sadness, the answers were a little bit different. The males really said that the females got more sad and didn't really talk about what was going on in the argument, where the females in the couple talked more about the concept and what was going on in the argument and everything about like what had happened. So it was really interesting to see that the females were looking at the meta messages and the content behind the argument, where the males just looked at the reaction. To conclude, there definitely is a difference between the way males and females argue and the way they comprehend conversation, starting from how they are raised as a baby and treated growing up to how they understand what their partner is saying and the concept of meta messages playing into that. It's really important to study this and to be able to understand behavioral patterns when it comes to arguments to help facilitate therapy or to prevent domestic violence, like I talked about in the beginning. Overall, I really enjoyed this project, and I think that this research is extremely beneficial to the world of communication. And I think that in the future, more research should be done on male and females in conversations and arguments when it comes to children and how they interact, and friendships and relationships and parent to child communication. But I think this research really has a good stepping stone into where this field needs to go. I hope that this presentation opened your eyes a little bit more into gender differences and communication styles. Thank you for watching/listening.